The bench creaked softly beneath the weight of the man, an unspoken warning as the quiet night seemed to hold its breath. Darren sat there, slouched but with an eerie composure, a figure out of place on this forgotten corner. His face, drawn with exhaustion, told the story of a man worn by time. Sweat clung to his dark skin, shimmering faintly under the flickering, unreliable light of a broken street lamp. It was past midnight, the streets of Kansas City unusually still, as though the city itself was asleep, untouched by the buzz of a typical Friday night. His shoulders hunched beneath the weight of his backpack, filled with tools from his day job as a mechanic, the second shift of the night, cleaning offices, still hanging heavily in his bones. All he wanted, all he craved, was to get home, slip into his warm recliner, and catch a few hours of sleep before the grind of the next day started all over again. A burst of laughter shattered the quiet. The voices were brash, cutting through the calm like a knife, each word like a stone tossed at the surface of the night. Darren's eyes flickered toward the group of young men, no more than 20-something, brash and loud. 4 of them, their oversized hoodies swallowed up their frames, and their words cut through the air like sharp blades. "Yo, old man," one of them called, his voice dripping with mockery. Darren didn't acknowledge them. He gripped his bag tighter, his fingers squeezing the worn leather like it was the last tether to his sanity. Another voice followed, this one more forceful, "What's up? You deaf?" The mockery rang out, louder now, aimed squarely at him. Still, Darren didn't flinch. He didn't even move. His eyes stayed locked ahead, his jaw set. His training had ingrained in him a discipline that ran deeper than the surface. This was nothing new. It was just noise. But the laughter didn't stop. The words, louder and sharper, began to gnaw at his patience. Then came the sound of an empty soda can hitting the concrete, rolling to a stop inches from his boots. Darren's face remained impassive, his features unreadable, but within, something stirred, a flicker of irritation. It was always the loud ones, the ones who thought they could just keep pushing. But Darren knew this game. He'd played it before, in places far darker and more dangerous. And still, he resisted the urge to rise. Sometimes, he thought, silence is the most powerful weapon, the calm before the storm. Yet even he knew that ignoring trouble doesn't always make it go away. Sometimes, it only makes it louder. Over the years, Darren had learned that some people, seeing a man tired and worn out, took it for weakness. They didn't see the scars beneath his skin, didn't know the man who'd survived 2 tours overseas, or the countless hours he'd spent sharpening skills that had saved lives, not just his own. Life after the Marines had been another kind of battlefield, one that didn't end with a medal. Jobs were scarce, bills piled up, and the sacrifices he had made for his country were met with indifference. Darren did what he had to, sometimes juggling 2 or 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. But through it all, he held on to his dignity, that silent strength that carried him through. Tonight, he was just another working man, dressed in faded blue and scuffed jeans, his steel-toed boots worn from years of hard labor. His hands, rough and calloused, rested on his knees. He wasn't dressed to impress anyone. No, he was simply waiting for the bus, hoping for a few moments of peace before the next battle began. But peace, it seemed, was too much to ask for. One of the young men moved closer, his sneakers dragging across the pavement, his voice thick with bravado. "What's the matter?" "Too good to talk to us," he sneered, inching toward Darren. Darren's gaze lifted just enough to meet his eyes. "I'm just waiting for my bus," he replied, his voice quiet, controlled, a stark contrast to the harshness of the group around him. The young man's smirk grew wider, and he turned to his friends, egging them on. "Did you hear that? He's too busy for us. Thinks he's better than us." Laughter followed, loud and mocking, bouncing off the walls of the empty street. Darren remained still, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the faint glow of headlights promised that escape was close. He took a slow, steady breath, centering himself. Then, the leader of the group, a wiry young man with a backwards baseball cap, stepped closer. "Man, look at you, sitting there like you own the place. Bet you don't even belong around here." His words were a challenge, and the air around them grew thick. Darren didn't respond. He didn't need to. He adjusted the strap of his backpack, the only sign that he'd even heard the taunt. But that silence, that simple act, only fed their fire, the tension rising. Another young man, emboldened by his friend's laughter, tossed a crumpled fast food wrapper at Darren. "Come on, old man. You scared or something?" Still, Darren didn't move, his face as calm as ever. But inside, he was analyzing the situation. His training, honed through years of experience, kicked in. For aggressors, all close range. The leader was trying to take charge. The postures of the group were all show, a lot of noise but not much substance, at least, that's what Darren hoped. But then the baseball cap took another step forward, crossing a line. This wasn't just words anymore. He shoved Darren's shoulder, hard enough to test him, just enough to provoke a reaction. That's when it happened. Darren stood, slow and deliberate, his movements fluid, controlled. He was taller, broader, his frame still powerful, a man forged in the fires of combat. "You don't want to do this," he said quietly, his voice unwavering, but laced with authority. The group erupted in laughter again, but something had shifted. There was a weight to Darren's words that they weren't expecting. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was something far more dangerous. "Who do you think you are, huh? Some kind of tough guy?" The baseball cap sneered, leaning in closer, his friends rallying behind him. Darren's breath was steady. "I'm giving you a chance to walk away," he said, his gaze locking with the young man's. "Don't waste it." But some people don't know how to walk away. They only understand one language, the hard way. The laughter that followed was forced, a nervous attempt to hide the tension. The group cheered, pushing the leader forward, and just like that, the situation escalated. The baseball cap lunged, swinging first, a wild, sloppy punch aimed at Darren's face. But Darren moved like water, his body sidestepping with fluid grace, his movements deliberate, his calm unwavering. Before the punch even had the chance to complete its arc, Darren's hand shot out like lightning, locking around the wrist of the one wearing the baseball cap. It was a grip that seemed to freeze time itself. "Stop," he growled, his voice low, commanding, and sharp, every word cutting through the chaos. But the others didn't care. They charged in. One lunged at his arm, another swung from his side. In the blink of an eye, Darren released his hold, pivoting his body as if the fight had already been mapped out in his mind. His training kicked in, fluid, automatic, one hand snatched the oncoming punch midair, twisting the attacker's arm just enough to send him sprawling to the ground with a sickening thud. The third man hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Darren to grab hold of his momentum, spinning him around and using it against him. The boy lost his footing, his legs buckling under the weight of his own motion, sending him tumbling to the pavement. The scuffle wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was precise, controlled. Darren wasn't out to hurt them, he just wanted to end it. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the remaining tension like a knife through cloth. His tone wasn't pleading, it was a demand, and it left no room for argument. The young men stumbled back, gasping for air, their eyes wide, their bravado evaporating in the cool night. Darren stood unshaken. His posture was like stone, unmoved, as though none of this had touched him. The silence that followed was absolute, deafening, a sharp contrast to the chaos that had reigned just moments before. But silence, Darren knew, speaks louder than any shout. And the lesson wasn't over yet. The young men remained frozen, their courage crumbling beneath the weight of his gaze. Baseball cap rubbed his wrist, his eyes flickering between his friends and Darren. He wanted to salvage what was left of his pride, wanted to shout something, anything, but the words refused to come. Darren's eyes swept across them, steady and unwavering, his calmness far more terrifying than any outburst. "You're lucky," he said, his voice measured and steady, "because I've had a long day. And I don't have the energy to teach you what real pain feels like." The words hung in the air, heavy, not because they were shouted, but because they were true. Darren had fought in places where life was raw and survival meant making split-second decisions, where pain was a constant companion. He had seen things that left scars deeper than any wound. These boys, they had no idea how close they'd come to crossing a line they could never return from. Baseball cap, desperate to recover, spat at the ground near Darren's feet. "Whatever, man. You ain't special." Darren took a slow step forward, his movements deliberate, measured. He closed the distance between them, his presence suffocating, unyielding. Stopping just inches away, he leaned in, his face now level with the young man's. "I'm not special," he said softly, his voice low but carrying a weight that made the words impossible to ignore. "But I've seen what happens to people who think they're untouchable. Trust me, you don't want to find out." The others shifted uneasily, glancing nervously between each other. their courage, their cocky grins, they were all fading, slipping away with every heartbeat. Darren's calm was far more unnerving than any shout could have been. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Straightening his back, he spoke again. I suggest you take this as your warning and walk away while you still can. They hesitated, their pride battling with the undeniable truth that they were outclassed, outmatched. Finally, one of them muttered, "Let's go," and started to back off. The others followed, reluctant and dragging their feet, throwing weak insults over their shoulders to save face. But Darren didn't flinch. He stood still, watching them until they disappeared down the block. The sound of their footsteps fading into the night was a small victory, one that Darren didn't feel the need to celebrate. He exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders to release the tension, the adrenaline slowly dissipating. He wasn't angry anymore. Not really. What he felt was something deeper, a sense of pity, perhaps frustration. Too many young men, too many like them, blinded by their need to prove something, often learning too late that the world doesn't owe them a damn thing. The distant rumble of the bus signaled its approach, and Darren sat back down on the bench, picking up his bag. The night felt heavier now, not because of what had happened, but because of what could have. For Darren, the lesson wasn't just for those boys. It was a reminder to himself too. The bus hissed as it arrived, its doors folding open with the reluctant sigh of a long journey. Darren climbed aboard, nodding politely at the driver, then made his way to an empty seat near the back. He dropped his bag on the floor, leaning back as the city lights blurred into streaks of yellow and white. The adrenaline had faded, leaving only the familiar weight of exhaustion. He wasn't proud of what had happened. But neither was he ashamed. He had given them every chance to walk away, and what they had received was the gentlest lesson he could offer. As the bus rolled through the quiet streets, Darren thought about the choices people make. The young men had been looking for trouble, and they had almost found more than they could handle. Where were they now, he wondered. Were they laughing it off? Or was some part of that encounter still eating at them? For Darren, the moment wasn't just about them. It was a reflection of his own journey. Life had thrown its punches at him too. He had been tested in ways those kids could never understand. And through it all, he'd learned the value of restraint, the power that comes not from fighting, but from choosing peace when the world is begging for conflict. A soft voice pulled him out of his thoughts. Long night, huh? The bus driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror. Darren chuckled faintly, nodding. You could say that. The driver gave a knowing smile and turned back to the road. Darren shifted in his seat, letting the hum of the engine soothe him as the bus neared his stop. He stood up, slinging his bag over his shoulder as he stepped off the bus and into the cool night air. The walk home was short, a simple stretch of pavement to his apartment. The familiar creak of the floorboards greeted him as he entered, setting his bag down. He collapsed into his recliner, staring up at the ceiling, the events of the night replaying in his mind, not with anger, but with quiet reflection. He thought about the lessons he'd learned, the hard way. The people who had shaped him into the man he was now. The battles he had fought, not always with fists, but with choices. Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones where you hold yourself back. And as the night settled around him, Darren arrived at a simple truth: respect is earned, not demanded. Those boys, like so many others, were trapped in a cycle of proving their worth in all the wrong ways. Darren hoped, just maybe, they'd look back on this night and realize the power of restraint. The dignity in walking away before it's too late. He sat there in his chair, deep in thought, not just about them, but about his own journey. How life had taught him that real power doesn't come from proving yourself to others. It comes from knowing your worth and staying true to it. Maybe, just maybe, those young men would carry this night with them, a quiet reminder of the man who didn't raise his fists but still left an impact they wouldn't soon forget. And as you reflect on Darren's story, ask yourself, what battles are worth fighting? And which ones are better left alone? Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is choose peace.